Thanks for checking out the Brad and John Show podcast. This segment of the show is brought to you by John Combest's book, Stalking, Harassment, Internet Trolling, A Guide to Recovering and Rebuilding After Online Attacks. It's a great reference if you've ever been the unfortunate target of a social media attack. It's available on Amazon. Just search John Combest. That's C-O-M-B-E-S-T, John Combest, and the book will show up in your search results. Now it's time for another segment of the Brad and John Show. Can you handle it?
I'm Egbert, the owner of this station. Check out my website at egbert.com. That's E-G-G-B-U-R-T, egbert.com. Now it's back to Brad and John. Check out their website at bjshow.co. The BJ Show? Come on, guys. Anyway, here's B and J.
Day after the election, and John and I are taking a look at what happened. By the way, before I get any further on this, you sent me a tweet this morning. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Can we talk about that on the air?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, that's fine. It was just a Rosenbaum tweet. Sure.
Right. Which is pretty funny.
I mean, nothing is, sorry for interrupting, Brad, but nothing is just a Rosenbaum tweet. Like, if Rosenbaum tweets, it's a Rosenbaum tweet, baby.
Well, once again, it goes back to this whole thing that you and I, being North County boys and knowing the lay of the land and knowing that Hazelwood East is not in any city, and technically it's not even in Spanish Lake. Essentially, the essence of the tweet is that, and I didn't even realize this, apparently the mayor of Hazelwood, who was up for re-election yesterday with the whole beating thing up there, got tons of hate mail, and I would imagine like nasty emails and mail and people
I'm
calling.
sure, yeah. Along with, and let's face it, let's be fair, along with Tashara Jones, the number of tweets I saw saying, this is what happens in St. Louis City under a Democrat mayor like Tashara Jones.
Right, and people don't even realize that it's not in St.
Right,
Louis.
they have no idea.
It's not in St. Louis City. It's not in Hazelwood. And, that is sort of weird because of the fact that only a very small percentage of the Hazelwood School District is actually in the city of Hazelwood. Most of it's unincorporated with a little bit in Florissant. So anyway, the tweet was essentially that he won re-election yesterday. The only problem was he was unopposed, so he didn't really win re-election. He just sort of won by default, correct? Isn't that what you look at?
Yeah, that's correct. Hey, let's not undermine good old Matt Robinson, Brad.
Well, I'm not saying
there
that.
could have been a write-in candidate.
I mean, if two baseball team, if there's a baseball game and only one team shows up, the other team doesn't win. They essentially get a win by forfeit. Or you know what I'm saying. Maybe I'm.
Well, yeah, and as Brad knows, because Brad at Brad's age, Brad still follows professional wrestling. I mean, who does that? And the title cannot change hands on a disqualification, Brad. Everybody knows that.
What was that again now?
I'm making a joke about how you don't watch wrestling and I do.
Well, hold it. What was that rule again?
Well, I know what's coming. The champion cannot lose the title by disqualification.
There's one disclaimer on that. There's one.
I'm ready.
One exception, and that exception is.
And you shall feel the pythons, brother.
If you would say that.
It's terrific. I mean, Hogan benefited from a lot of lazy rule enforcing. He broke a lot of rules when he was the face champion, but that's a different story. But you were saying Francis Howell.
Well, I was saying Francis Howell because we are on. We are on.
What are we on?
Our sacred airwaves.
So remember.
Oh yes, we are, Brad.
And you know what I saw Sunday, which I've never seen before.
I'm ready.
Say hello to oyster bunnies.
The oyster bunny. That was so. By the way, that's one of those social media things, Brad, that I saw that quote and I'm like, okay, this is wildly out of context. Like, I never believe anything I see on social media.
Yeah.
And then I heard it and I'm like, oh wow, okay.
Our president, he's on the portico or the porch, whatever, the White House, and he's flanked by, now here's something else I found interesting. He's flanked by Mr. and Mrs. Easter Bunny. The one bunny is obviously trying to look like a male, and the other one's looking like a female. How come nobody's complaining about that? How come?
Yeah, it's very cisgender normative is
Right.
what it's called. And that's a real term, cisgender normative. It's like heteronormative. You're suggesting that a couple is always a male and a female.
Right, and why aren't there like 34 different bunnies up there? And this is the bunny, and this is the anyway.
Well, here's why. Because he needs to leave a little bit of growth for Kamala Harris when she's president next year, Brad.
I guess. So he calls them the oyster bunnies.
Well, you know what? If the newly elected Francis Howell School Board gets its way, we may learn about that, which leads into what you were about to say, Brad.
Okay, so Marc Cox, and once again, I'll preface this by saying I have the utmost respect for Marc Cox. Marc Cox is a true journalist, worked around the country. I think he's originally from Ohio, worked in West Virginia, a couple other different cities, ended up here in St. Louis at KMOV, had a long, distinguished career at KMOV. Marc Cox was one of those guys, when he came on TV, he was a field reporter for a while, then I think he did the morning show. When he came on TV, my opinion, he spoke the truth. He wasn't like spinning things. You always felt that he was giving you the straight scoop. And I think he's sort of old school journalist kind of dude, not the current kind of, generation where they're going to spin it around. Well, the president, and a lot of people don't know that there really are oyster bunnies, and that's a very rare kind of oyster, and it's a bunny, what I mean? They're just going to do anything to, essentially present their side as being correct or whatever. So anyway, he's been very involved with this. He started, I guess, last year where he was super involved with the school district races in St. Charles County and in St. Louis County, to the point where he had his own little thing. He had his
a slate. You could say a slate.
He had a slate. You could download it from the website. Here's Marc Cox approved candidates. Yeah. So they did it again this year. And matter of fact, they had an event out at the Soda Museum, whatever it is, out there on Main Street in St. Charles last month. And every one of the conservative candidates in both St. Louis and St. Charles County lost. Every single one of them. Not one of them made it in. Now,
yeah, and that was, by the way, not to interrupt, Brad, but that's the second sentence in the Post-Dispatch story. The second sentence is exactly what you said. None of the 13 candidates endorsed by right-wing talk radio host Marc Cox won after campaigning against what he called a, quote, woke agenda, unquote, in schools. So clearly the Post-Dispatch wants you to know that Marc Cox supported a slate of candidates, but that he failed, Brad.
Well, I'm not going to gloat on this, but I'm just going to say that we have another station here, and it's called Westplex 107.1. And that's how John and I got to know each other, because I don't know how in the world he ended up listening to me on Westplex 107.1. But I did a morning show with Shelley Barr. And this station is geared at women. Matter of fact, the transmitter sits out right at the corner of Bryan and Feisey Road in the heart of O'Fallon, in the heart of the Westplex, okay? And we cater to suburban women, women who live in St. Charles County. I think it is very easy to say they're suburban women. Wouldn't you agree with that, John?
Yeah, of course they are, yeah.
Right. It's like women.
Soccer moms. They're the old soccer moms, right?
It's like women who live in Chesterfield or any of those communities like that. And especially in St. Charles County, because it is the epitome of being a suburban community, and they're women, and they have kids, and they go to PTA meetings and stuff like that, okay? How often, when you turn on a political shows, are these like the national shows? Well, Trump has problems with the suburban women, and the suburban women are the ones who are going to make or break the Trump election, or anybody running for election, if they talk about you got to have the suburban women, right?
Yeah.
Okay, Westplex 107, caters to suburban women. And guess what? I get like zero political advertising. Zero. Now, the problem is that, and I'm not trying to cut down, other people, but lots of those people on Francis Howell spent big money on 97.1. Nothing against 97.1. Great radio station. I listen to it quite often. The problem is, if you understand radio, 90% of people that listen to talk radio, being it sports talk, political talk, are, guess what, John? Guess what they are?
What are they, Brad?
They're dudes like you and me, right?
Yeah.
It's like there's very few women who listen to talk radio. Sports, practically none. Political talk radio, maybe 10, 15%, maybe 20% on a good day. So I'm saying they should have spent money with me. You know what I mean?
I get what you're saying. And Brad, so before we get to actually talking about the Francis Howell election, which I think we're going to do, I would also posit here, as I've told you before, because I'm your friend, I don't want this to turn into low self-esteem theater where you talk about, well, why won't anybody advertise with me? I would submit, as I have before, in fact, yesterday, that 97.1 has been around a little bit longer than Westplex 107.1, has a little bit bigger advertising budget, and I would assume that the handful of people that make the decisions about where to spend money in a campaign are slightly more familiar with the station that's been around 20 plus years than Westplex 107.1. So to me, Brad, that sounds like a marketing issue. Now, I say that as your friend because I refuse, as I often do, to stand by while we do low self-esteem theater here, because I think it's a marketing issue and not anything else.
John, have you ever heard of Chevrolet?
No, never heard of them.
You ever heard of Ford?
Are they one of those Japanese companies?
No, you ever heard of Ford?
Yes.
Ford Motor Company. You ever heard of Chrysler, whatever they're called nowadays?
Yep.
Okay.
And where is the chase and when can we cut to it?
We've
had enough of a preamble. Go ahead, bro.
Those name brands have been around for over 100 years in the automotive industry, right? Okay.
Yep.
And yet there are people who, when the Kias first showed up in St. Louis, I'm going to go buy a Kia, had no track record, had no brand awareness, nothing like that.
I gotcha. Brad, you're completely right about this. Can we talk about the Francis Howell election?
No, we got to talk about this.
I mean, the insider stuff, I know people love it and they get an education, but I want to hear what your opinion, what Marc Cox had to say about the Francis Howell elections, and then maybe what we think about it.
Well, he was ticked off. He was upset because of the fact that, and he essentially said, and I think this is probably distilling his whole theory that last year they caught the quote-unquote NEA establishment by surprise. They essentially bound this group together, and we're the rebels, and we're gonna take back. You know, they were like in Star Wars. They were Luke Skywalker going against, the Death Star. You know what I mean? And the Death Star meaning, how's that for a great analogy?
Yeah, I've never seen Star Wars, but go ahead.
The Death Star being the NEA. So last year they caught him by surprise, and they slipped that missile. You don't know this part, but they slipped that missile down that ventilation hole, and they blew up the Death Star.
Brad, I know what it's like to slip a few past. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
I made a career out of that.
Right. So this year, the NEA, they closed off that ventilation hole, and when the rebels, being the conservatives, in St. Charles County and St. Louis County, especially in St. Charles County, decided they were going to fire that missile and blow up the NEA Death Star, the port wasn't open. And the Death Star, in turn, turned around, turned on their photon torpedo machines, whatever, and blew the conservatives out of the sky. How's that for an analogy?
That's a great analogy. Now, 99% of the people listening to this, Brad, do not live in the Francis Howell School District. So let's think of how this applies to them, because it does. We had huge storms here in the St. Louis region, and I'm looking out my window right now, Brad, at a roofing shingle, okay? And huge destruction in this area. Yesterday, I got 2 flyers on my door because, as you know, I don't answer when people come to the door. I got 2 flyers for roofing people, right? And maybe in 2 weeks, a pack of gypsies will come and try to sell me some roofing because, hey, we just happen to be in the neighborhood. We noticed you could use whatever. Now, there will be a ton of political consultants, Brad, that will go to Marc Cox, that will go to Francis Howell families and others and sell them a bill of goods and say, you need to hire us now for X amount of dollars and we will win your school board election. So one of the things that we should talk about as we go forward is when conservatives / libertarians get their butts kicked like we did yesterday, how does it happen, Brad? And I mean, we have to take the anger out of it. We have to take the frustration. And the simple answer, Brad, that every consultant will give you is, well, it was the messaging. You didn't do a good enough job with the messaging. You need more messaging. Brad, here's the hard question. What if the messaging from these 2 candidates was actually exactly what they believed? And what if voters in Francis Howell said, that's a little too right-wing for us? Now, Brad, you have made a salient point multiple times on this show about the fact that you feel that the district went very boring to too far left, to too far right, and the pendulum may swing back. You've made that very prescient point multiple times. What if that is true in this case, Brad? And which of these GOP consultants, who, by the way, will come to you and say, hey, you need to hire me to run your campaigns, and I got a voter data list that I stole in 2006 from the Missouri Republican Party, and you need to just pay me, and I'll upcharge printing by 3,000%. I'm Survey St. Charles, or make up some name, right? So the question that we should be asking is, where are voters really in this district? And then secondly, Brad, and then I'll quit this rant, according to my dear friend Chris Ferguson, who's a great follow on Twitter at Crystal Ferguson. There was the voter turnout was 16.3% yesterday, Brad, and Francis Howell. Now, assuming that number's right, I sure saw a whole lot of Republican campaign operatives and candidates tweeting about how much they were helping these conservative school board candidates. Success has 1,000 fathers, but failure is an orphan. Where were these candidates to turn over their voter list to help drive turnout? I know a lot of these guys have other campaigns, but Brad, where were these guys and where were these political operatives to actually get people to the polls?
Now, are you
That's
talking,
my rant for Francis Howell, Brad.
You talking about current office holders as far as
I'm talking about anybody in the conservative community in St. Charles County who loved posting pictures and saying, I endorse candidate XYZ. Now, for all we know, Brad, they spent yesterday at the polls handing out their literature, encouraging candidates to do that, and I'm sure some of them did. But what I'm getting at, Brad, is for all the political operatives that say, hey, we stand up, we're Republicans and we stand up for these candidates, how many township committee people were out there actually delivering voters to the polls, Brad?
Well, but I understand what you're saying, but let me just try to focus a little bit more. When you're saying political operatives, you're talking everybody from the township people all the way up to like current office holders, like state reps and senators and things like that, who were not
folks
in
like
the
that.
election.
And I'm also thinking, Brad, about people who are campaign operatives who get paid to do this. So people who work in campaigns in St. Charles County.
Well, can I ask you something else too?
Yeah, sure.
You got kids in school. Was Francis' house closed yesterday?
They were, yeah.
Okay, because one thing before we take our truncated break, because we're on a weird schedule this morning because we have some technical difficulties at the top of the show, Marc Cox also alluded to the fact that the NEA was in force because a lot of the teachers, a lot of the polling places were in schools and the teachers didn't have to go anywhere. But I'm thinking to myself, okay, and it's a funny thing that the reason I was pretty sure that Francis Howell was closed yesterday because I drove on Highway 94, and I have a Klondike Park story to tell you.
And you are beating the table, Brad.
You hear me doing it?
You are beating the table. You're so enthusiastic. I mentioned last Friday on the show that both the Parkway School District and the Francis Howell School District were both off school on Tuesday.
Well, his point was that the teachers didn't have to go anywhere because of the fact that they were right at school. And I'm thinking to myself, well, if Francis Howell, the teachers weren't at school yesterday, so they did have to get in their car, drive to school. And I have to be honest with you, in my opinion, this is IMHO, a lot of these teachers, if they don't have to go to school, they're not going. You know?
Yeah. Or, Brad, it's also a good opportunity for them to stand at a polling place and hand out stuff at their kid at the school that they teach and say, hey, yes, oh, look, it's Mrs. Jenkins. Hey, listen, I'm supporting my friend, old liberal gal and old so-called pastor for Francis Howell School Board,
John, that would take much too much effort on their part because of the
fact.
It
might be. Let's go into break.
They're already their day off. Why would they go? For example, like if the election was on Saturday, do you think that any of these school teachers would go to school on Saturday to campaign for No, it's Saturday. They don't work Saturdays, remember?
That's true, and most people don't, though, Brad.
Okay, we're going to take a break.
Thanks for checking out the Brad and John Show podcast. This segment of the show is brought to you by John Combest's book, Stalking, Harassment, Internet Trolling, A Guide to Recovering and Rebuilding After Online Attacks. It's a great reference if you've ever been the unfortunate target of a social media attack. It's available on Amazon. Just search John Combest. That's Combest, John Combest, and the book will show up in your search results. Now it's time for another segment of the Brad and John Show. Can you handle it?